pride won't let them admit that their gut check is wrong, and will be like, God told me, or God showed me, or I feel like God is saying. Don't drag God into your delusions. Take your L on the chin, say that you were wrong, so that you can learn how to discern better. I am not a nice Christian. I'm kind, I'll be loving. In this new wave of nice Christianity, we don't want to be viewed as judgmental, and so we've lost our ability to be shrewd. If you can be right and still taste the effects of death in a situation, then how important is being right or wrong? There's a difference between having a critical spirit and have a critical mind. Life is already complicated. We're the ones that are too simple to navigate it. Spiritual Intelligence for Dummies, welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Matt Kim, and Happy New Year. I think by the time you're watching this recording, it's going to be 2025, and so this will probably be the first episode drop of the new year, and so happy New Year. 2025 is going to be really exciting, not just for this channel, but I think for the people of God. It's going to be a very interesting year. A lot of things I think are going to go down at scale across the world, and I think at the center of change, at the center of progress is going to be the Church of Jesus, and that's very exciting. That's really fun. And so in that spirit, today we're going to be talking about discernment. I believe that discernment is going to be a very important tool that we're going to need in our tool belt in this upcoming year, because things are going to appear one way but be something completely different, and vice versa. And I don't know if you can relate to that now, right? Do you feel disillusioned at all? Do you feel like you thought something was this thing, but it ended up being this way? You thought something was a vine, but it ended up being a snake. And then you saw something that you perceived to be a snake, but it ended up being a vine. This will throw anyone off, right? It's very hard to navigate life when we are living on a below the surface level, when we're living deeper than just the surface, and when we're living as spiritual beings. Because not everything is always as it seems, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't really need to reckon with our spirituality. We could just be flesh and bones, living life on the surface as it seems, because everything is literal. Everything is as it seems, but it's not. That's not how life goes down. And so I believe that this is a year where that phenomena of disillusionment, where things are not as they appear, is going to be heightened like never before. And so when things look bad in the midst of that, we have to perceive that God is doing something completely different, something good. And if we can perceive that, we could be a benefactor and recipient of that. We can partner with God in creating something brand new. And believe it or not, there's a reward attached to that. And so in that spirit, I want to jump into the topic of discernment. You know, discernment throws a lot of people off. It's a skill that we have abdicated. A lot of times I think God gives us certain gifts and abilities, and in the name of yielding to God, we throw it back in his face. When in reality, the gifts of God are irrevocable, right? They're without repentance. That means that if God gives you a gift, he's not going to take it back. But we give it back to him a lot, don't we? Right? He gives us a gift, we give it back to him. He gives us prophecy, we give it back to him. Oh God, we don't believe in this. We don't believe in prophecy. We don't believe that the Spirit moves today, so we give it back to him. He gives us tongues. We give it back to him. He gives us healing. We give it back to him. He gives us discernment. We give it back to him. And instead, we pray for a miracle to come from outside, for the heavens to open up, crack open, and, little cherub baby angels, which they don't even look like that, to come down and do the will of God for us, without realizing that, hey, look, I'm the miracle. Right? There comes a point in every believer's life when we realize that we are no longer on, social services of the kingdom of heaven, and we are actually maturing children of God taking on more responsibility. I'm not saying that we ever come to a place where we, you know, we steal the glory of God and take the credit. He will always be our source, right? He will always be our principle, our prime. He'll always be the reason and the power through which we do anything and everything. But look, he gave you a will. He gave you a choice. He gave you the ability to walk out what it is that he's called us to do of your own volition, right? Otherwise, it would not bring God glory as a father for us to remain infants. And so discernment is very much one of those skills that falls under that category, that God has given it to us as a gift and we've given it back to God. And so instead we depend on things like a prophetic word, which is a completely different ability than discernment, right? I believe discernment is within the prophetic faculty, but it is a different thing than prophecy. Discernment is different than prophecy. And we're going to get into that. With discernment, we rely solely off of our gut check, our gut intuition. And how well has that worked out for you? Probably not very well. Matter of fact, it probably puts more people into the position of doubling down on their entitled gut, intuitions that has no qualifying metrics. And when things play out opposite to what they discerned, their pride won't let them admit that their gut check was wrong. So it's not even just a gut check, right? Matter of fact, we'll have a gut check and then we'll put God's name on it. We'll have a gut check and we'll be like, God told me, or God showed me, or I feel like God is saying. Don't drag God into your delusions. That's very inappropriate. Just take your L on the chin, say that you were wrong, so that you can learn how to discern better, right? You have to be humble, right? Stop protecting yourself. It's doing nothing for you. Now, I'm really excited to get into some of the practical parts of discernment, some of the tool sets, but I will say this. I will say that when it comes to discernment, the thing that we have learned to not do is to be shrewd. We believe that when we are shrewd, for some reason, right? It's this new wave of like nice Christianity, right? I am not a nice Christian, okay? I'm kind, I'll be loving, but I value justice, right? I value the will of God. And if you perceive that I am not nice, well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to, come out and try to offend you. That is a very different thing. But niceness is not a value. It's not a high value for what animates me to do what I do and say what I say, right? So in this new wave of nice Christianity, we don't want to be viewed as judgmental, and so we've lost our ability to be shrewd. To be shrewd is to assess things accurately, meaning that we have no accuracy in our perceptions of reality. In other words, you're delusional. You're absolutely delusional. And we're only this way because we've given up the very way by which God allows us to be accurate, precise, discerning in the material realm, which is to be shrewd, which is to really calculate and measure and analyze and break down what we're perceiving. Instead, we jump the gun, right? We assume more than we ask. And so, think about what Jesus said, right? What did Jesus say? He said, he called us. It's a calling. He's called us to be as pure as what? Pure as a dove, and as shrewd as what? As shrewd as a serpent. So why aren't we doing that? We only have half the equation. See, if you are pure but not shrewd, like the Western church, like this new wave of nice Christianity, if you are pure but you're not shrewd, you are a child. You're an infant, right? You have a great heart, you have good intentions, but you lack the stature and the cognition, the intelligence and maturity, and the wisdom in order to act in a way that brings about the most fruit, in a way that brings about life, we're a victim, right? All we have is our intentions. So what? What is that going to do? I bet you've had intentions in the past, right? You've had intentions to start a new project, to start a business, and intentions to better your relationships with people. But for some reason, it may or may not have worked out. If it hasn't worked out, why is that? Is because we lack the shrewdness in order to navigate it with a level of maturity and power. We need power. We need authority. It's not enough just to be nice. That is the basic level. Now, on the flip side, the inverse is true. You can be shrewd without being pure. In which case, let's just wrap up this whole thing and just call it a day. Because shrewdness without purity will just make you a more clever devil. Like, you are not contributing anything to the kingdom of God, and you're an agent of darkness. So being a cynic, being a nihilist is nothing to brag about, right? You are contributing nothing to the world around you. And so this is why Jesus says that we must be as pure as doves and as shrewd as serpents. If you only have one part of that, you have failed the test because you have half the equation. Half the equation is not the full equation. You're not going to get the full answer, okay? So we don't want to be childish. We don't want to be pure but not shrewd. We don't want to be a nihilist. We don't want to be a cynic. We don't want to be shrewd but not pure. So we need both faculties in order to be wise and mature in the way we walk about life. Okay? Now, this is the blueprint of discernment, is to have a pure intention but a shrewd perception. Pure intention, shrewd perception. Because what makes you judgmental? It's the posture of your heart. Do you sit in the seat of Lord? You shouldn't, because we only serve one Lord. That's God. It's Jesus. He has the seat of judgment. We do not occupy that seat in that way. So if your heart is pure, meaning that you have taken on the mantle of being a minister of reconciliation, which is to be a kingdom agent, and you know that that is your mission, but in order to do that, you need to see things as they are so that you can form that thing into what it should be according to the heart of God. Do you understand what I'm saying? It does you no good to have a wool over your head and have no clarity or insight. And this is where we could talk about the difference between the prophetic and discernment. Prophecy and discernment is not the same thing. Discernment is your ability to accurately perceive what is true and real in the natural. Prophecy is your ability to perceive what is true and real in eternity according to the heart and mind of God. Right? So prophecy is an eternal thing. Discernment is temporal. So if I could discern everything in this world accurately, but I don't have the prophetic faculty functioning, then I can never elevate or upgrade this broken world to this magnitude of a revelation of God. It means I'm stuck. Do you ever feel that way? You know, you're in a cycle with your spouse, maybe. You're in a cycle with family. Maybe you're in a cycle in your place of work. You discern everything perfectly. You're right. You're always right. Right? You're always vindicated. You think to yourself, I told you so. But if you're so right? If you're so clever, why hasn't the situation changed? Maybe you're not perceiving prophetically. Maybe you're only perceiving naturally. Maybe you only have discernment but no prophecy. Because prophecy will give you God's intention for how he desires the situation to be and how he views it in the realm of eternity. Do you know that God views people in your life very differently than you do? He views them according to his intention, according to his heart, according to how he made them in his image. Do you view them the same way? If you're highly discerning, that would be very difficult for you, which is why we got to work on it. Again, the inverse is true. You could be very prophetic, but live like a fool. And that's not a compliment. I mean like an actual fool. Because you're not discerning. You get taken advantage of. You feel like you are constantly betrayed. You make the same mistakes over and over again. You trust people too much. You make decisions that you thought were powerful in faith, but they panned out to mean nothing and produced no results. So then you got to soothe yourself and tell yourself that, oh yeah, it was God working a process in me, it might be true, but you still made a decision that was detrimental in other areas of your life. How do you account for that? You can't just keep gaslighting yourself, right? That can only go so far. Sometimes you got to reckon with reality as it is. So then what do you do when you're so strong in the prophetic? You could hear what God is saying about a situation, but you are blind in the natural. We got to work on our discernment. We got to learn to be shrewd, right? Prophecy it comes from being pure, right? Remember, pure as doves, shrewd as serpents. Prophecy comes from purity. Discernment comes from shrewdness. Do you understand? Prophecy comes from pureness. Discernment comes from shrewdness. And so I don't know which one you identify with. Are you someone who's prophetic but you lack discernment? Well, then you got to work on your discernment, buddy. Or are you someone that, has discernment, but you're a little cynical and you don't have prophecy? You got to ask God for the prophetic, for a prophetic heart, for a pure heart. Blessed are the pure in heart. Why? For they will see God. Do you see God in your situation? Do you see God in the people that are upsetting you? Do you see God? And again, I want to emphasize that both of these things are equally important. Equally important. Because both parties have such pride around their perspective, they think, look, you don't perceive the will of God, then you are so carnal. You're not prophetic. And yet they're victimized by their ignorance. The flip is true, right? The person who's very discerning but not prophetic, they'll be like, bro, you are in la la land all the time. You're always in heaven, but you haven't done anything. You can't hold a job. You're depending on other people. Like, that's embarrassing. Why don't you focus on some natural responsibilities first? And yet, they have no vision for their life. They're stuck in a cynical loop. So what good are either of them, right? I'm being serious. They're equally important. Half the equation, you're still failing. You're still falling short. So what we want to do is we want to bridge the gap. We want to have both. You can have both. You should have both. It might not come easy to you because you'll probably sway one direction, but you need both in order to walk in wisdom and power to change the world around you and reconcile it back to Christ. Do you understand? Yeah. Now, another tool that I want to maybe verbally process with you is this idea of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Remember, in Genesis, when the serpent, a shrewd little thing, the serpent tempted Adam and Eve, the serpent was getting them to eat from a specific tree, right? Do you remember this? This tree happens to be one that God did not permit them to eat from. Now, we don't really know if they were never ever meant to eat from it or they just weren't meant to eat from it then and there. I'm of the belief that there would be a time, a right time, when it would be good for us to eat from that tree. I just think they jumped the gun a little bit and did it prematurely. Now, the alternative, I mean, they could eat from any other tree, just not that tree. And the tree was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, I know we could get into, again, guys, this is a spiritual podcast. This is a spiritual channel. It's not science. It's not a scientific channel. It's not a channel on psychology. It's not a channel. It's spiritual, okay? So we are a channel that talks about meaning. We're a channel that talks about values. We're a channel that talks about spiritual things, okay? So then we could go down the rabbit hole of, okay, is Genesis a literal account or is it more allegorical? Is it symbolic or is it historical? That's a very valid debate that happens among not just Bible scholars, but anyone who really cares about the power and potency of the scriptures, right? I'll say this, look. Every book should be symbolic, even if it's literal. Because if it's not symbolic, then it has no meaning. And if it has no meaning, it has no relevance or life to offer us now, right? It's just history. It's just facts. It's just observation. So I don't care what book you're reading from. Every book in the Bible should have meaning. And so by extension, it is allegorical and it is symbolic, even if it's historical. And so that absolutely applies to Genesis. So when we're talking about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is it a literal tree or is it a metaphor? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because even if it was a literal tree, the literal existence of that tree would have to have a meaning, would it not? So then let's talk about that meaning. Because we can't find the tree on the earth right now. But I bet you we can access the spiritual reality of what that tree is in the realm of the spirit. And by extension, we can access it and access a revelation of God in that story to the extent that we can discover it, right? So let's talk about it. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I believe that that tree was a tree that allows us to measure the natural dimension, but from a place of governance. I believe that's what God's intention for us was that we would mature with God as we walked with God, as Adam and Eve walked with God, that they would mature to a place of wisdom and stewardship and stature as governors of the earth, that they would be ready to handle the knowledge of good and evil and govern over it instead of eating of it too early, which they did, and now being being governed by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So why is this important? Why am I saying this? It's because there's a lot of things in the spiritual space that we have demonized. I believe the knowledge of good and evil is one of those things, right? Because Adam and Eve ate of that tree and they condemned humanity. We believe that it is an evil tree. Well, God made it, didn't he? So he made this evil tree. Is that what you're saying? No. I believe the tree is ultimately meant for good. It's the context in which we engage with what God created that made it evil, right? It made it bad. So then we got to ask ourselves, what is the good intention of the tree? I believe that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil allows us to have governance over the material realm because it allows us to measure and judge creation. It's a judgy tree. It's a knowledge, right? It's knowledge of what? Of good and evil. That's a discerning function, right? That's a judging function. I am judging what is good and what is evil. But here's a problem. I cannot judge what is good and evil without first understanding the currency that God really cares about, which is life and death. Because trust me, man, God doesn't really care about the knowledge of good and evil if we don't have a revelation of life and death. Because although we measure things by right or wrong, we create laws around what's good and evil and what's right or wrong, and we make judgments about these things. God measures things by life and death. I'm going to say that again. We measure things by what's right and wrong. God measures things by what produces life and death. Do you understand? And so when something ultimately produces life in the fullness of time, then we could say, oh, this is good. And we'd be right. If something produces death, right, for the wages of sin is death, if something produces death in the fullness of time, then we could look at the fruit, the end result, and say, oh, this was bad. This was wrong. But because we primarily eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we don't really eat from the tree of life. We have a different way of measuring things, which is wrong, which is, oh, is this right or is this wrong? Is this good or is this evil? Without asking ourselves, is this producing life or is this producing death? Because I promise you, you probably can relate to this. You've been right about so many things, yeah? You've discerned it perfectly. You knew someone was in a toxic relationship and you were waiting for them to break up. And when they broke up, you might not have said it to their face. Maybe you did. Maybe you're just like that. But you definitely thought to yourself, I told you so. So you were right. But where's the life? Where is the life in that situation? Maybe you could experience it, in your own life. You know someone in your family is very toxic, very controlling, manipulative. We all have people like that in our families. And you were right about them. Did that change the situation? Did that make it better? Do you taste life or are you still tasting death? So then how important is being right or wrong really? It's not that important, is it? It's not that important. If you can be right and still taste the effects of death in a situation, then how important is being right or wrong? Very marginally important. It's not that important. So although we measure things by what's right or wrong, good and evil, and we judge prematurely, what God cares about is what produces life and what produces death. And when we can perceive that, we'll be able to navigate life with wisdom and tact in a way that we haven't been able to do before. And so I want us to shift that paradigm. And this is the precise reason why the wisdom of man is foolishness to God. Because the wisdom of man is measured by the currency of the knowledge of good and evil. We're eating from that tree still. That's the wisdom of man. But the wisdom of God comes when we eat from the tree of life. Do you understand? And so, if you want wisdom, you need to eat from a different tree. If you want wisdom, you need to eat from the tree of life. So then the next time you are quick to judge, you must ask yourself, what tree am I eating from? And guys, look, this is a spiritual tree. Do you understand? This is a spiritual tree. Meaning you have to deal with it in the realm of the spirit, in the realm of your insides, of your invisible, of your heart. What does that mean? That means I'm talking about your intentions. I'm talking about purity. That's what it means to be as pure as doves. In your spirit, this is where we deal with this stuff. In the natural, in your mind, in your intellect, you should still be very shrewd. Again, I don't want to undermine what I said at the beginning of this podcast. You should be very shrewd. Very shrewd. To the point where if someone were to be led into your process, they might misunderstand you and say, you're being very judgmental, but you have no judgment in your heart. Do you understand? It's a dichotomy. It's very hard for people to walk this out. It's a tension because you know in your heart you are pure. But again, you have to examine yourself, right? You have to examine yourself. Are you really pure? You might not be. You might just actually be judgmental. Investigate. It's important, man. Like, you might be sabotaging yourself if you don't ask yourself that. So investigate. But if you have a clean conscience and you really feel like you're being pure, people could still judge you, and that is fine. Don't let that stop you from being shrewd. You need to see clearly. That means you got to be critical. There's a difference. Look, man, there's a difference between having a critical spirit and have a critical mind. If you were flying on an airplane and your pilot did not have a critical mind, you would get off that plane because you don't know what's about to go down. Do you understand what I'm saying? You need a critical mind, but you should not have a critical spirit. And this is a tension that stunts the growth of most Christians, because we have never been confronted with the call to rise to that level of tension, to somehow retain a pure heart and not be critical in the spirit, but at the same time, to have a shrewd and critical mind. No one is preaching this thing. Okay, I won't say no one, but you know what I'm saying. It's not a very common message because it's not feel good and it makes things complicated. But look, life is already complicated. We're the ones that are too simple to navigate it. Yeah? So that's kind of my two-piece about discernment. That's what I think. I hope these tools are helpful. I hope the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's some food for thought, literally and figuratively. And I hope that you can start employing some of these tools, some of these revelations into your life, because you're going to need it. 2025 is going to be a year where things are not going to appear as they are. Not everything you see is going to be what it really is. And so in the midst of that, we can't get wrapped up in the optics of the narrative of things, right? Things might seem dark. Things might seem chaotic. Things might seem one way. But unless we have the discernment to see through it and perceive reality in the natural as it actually is, and then to go even deeper, to perceive God's good intentions in the midst of all the things that seem bad. Again, I said seems bad because we're suspending judgment. We're not judging what's good and evil. We're judging what brings life and death. So we need to perceive the will of God. And so 2025, it's going to be that year, man. Discernment's going to be important. The prophetic is going to be extremely important. And so tap in, okay? Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this video if it brought value to you, if it was helpful for you. I'd love to stay connected so that you could, receive from more videos as I pump them out, because there's a lot more to come. And I will catch you next week, next Monday, same time, same place. I'll talk to you soon.